Levi Brackman here with Truth's Jewish Wisdom for today. This is Torah Portion Uncensored. This is the third episode. We are on Parshat Shmini. And I'm going to do a very brief episode this week because I'm recording it from beautiful Evergreen, Colorado. I used to be the rabbi here for 14 years. I'm here visiting and I'm here on business. My commitment is to do one episode each week on the Torah Portion. So I'm just going to record a very short episode. Before I begin, if you enjoy this podcast, please like it, leave a review, whether it's on Apple Podcasts, whether it's on Spotify, whether it's on YouTube, wherever you listen to it. That helps other people find it. Now that I've got that out of the way, let's jump into this week's Torah portion. It starts off the first verse, chapter 9, Vayi Bayom Hashmini, and it was on the eighth day of the inauguration of the Tabernacle. The Tabernacle had been going through inauguration for 7 days. It brought up all the various sacrifices, and it was on the eighth day that Moses called to Aaron and his sons and to the elders of Israel. Now, this is really interesting because the elders don't show up very often in Leviticus, twice in Leviticus. Once here and one is in chapter 4, verse 15, where it talks about a sin offering which has to be brought because of an unintentional sin. And it says in that verse, chapter 4, verse 15, it says, and the elders of Israel rested their hands on the head of the bullock in front of God, and they slaughtered the bullock in front of God. And this was God telling Moses what would happen if these different events occurred. So the elders show up. The elders do play a role somewhat in the sacrifices. And we don't hear anything about the elders again until this verse in the Torah portion of this week where it says it was on the eighth day and Moses calls Aaron, his sons, and the elders of Israel. What's really interesting is that in the previous chapter, the chapter which talks about the different sacrifices that took place during the inauguration, during the Yimei HaMiluim. We spoke about the last episode where it really means Yimei HaMiluim, the days in which they were filling their hands. It's the days in which they were getting busy. It's the days in which the priests were starting to actually work, and now they would have their hands filled with the service in the tabernacle. So that's the inauguration. We spoke about that last week. But what's really interesting is a couple of anomalies in the text. And I want to point out and ask two open-ended questions. And I don't really have answers to these questions, so you out there, please, if you have answers, please let me know. But these are two open-ended questions that I'm going to ask. The first one is that in last week's Torah portion, you have a couple of verses which seem to be written in a way which is strange. The first one is chapter 8 of Leviticus, verse 15. It says, "Vayishchat vayikach Moshe Sadam vayitin al karnis hamizbeach saviv v'etzboi." And he slaughtered it, and Moses took the blood and he put it on the corners of the altar around it with his finger. And all the commentators ask the question immediately and say, you have two poils, which are two verbs, one after the other. And if you have two verbs, one after the other, you should have a name in between. You don't say, and he slaughtered, and he took Moses. It should say, and Moses slaughtered, and he took. But it doesn't say that. It says, and he slaughtered, and he took Moses, the blood, etc. So it's an anomaly in the text. And the commentators answer whatever they answer on that. But it actually shows up in this text many times, and it's a feature in this text. For example, you find in the next verse, it says, verse 19, you find in verse 19, it says, Vayishchat, and he slaughtered, Vayizrak, and he sprinkled, Moshe es Adam, Moses the blood. What it really should have said was, Vayishchat Moshe, Moshe slaughtered, Vayizrak es Adam, and he sprinkled the blood. But what you also find that this is an anomaly in the text in verse 18, where it says, Vayakre ves eila oila v'yismuch Aaron avon v'sidem aresha oil. And they brought close the ale, the ram of the oila, then v'yismuch Aaron avon v'sidem aresha oil. And Aaron and his sons placed their hands on the head of the ram. What really should have said was, and Aaron and his sons brought close the ale of the oila, and then they placed their hands on top of the head of the ram. Instead of saying, and they brought close the ram of the oila, and they placed the hand, Aaron and his sons, on the head of the ram. In other words, this is a feature that you find a verb, and then another verb, and then the person's name. And it seems that really there could be another person's name added in here. And that it could have been, if you look at it, let's go back to verse 15. It could have said, Vayishchat, and they slaughtered. Who slaughtered? Vayishchat, Echad me'azkenim, one of the elders slaughtered it. And then Vayikach Moshe es Adam, and then Moses took the blood. Let's have a look also in the next one. In verse 18, it says, Vayakrev es Eil ha'olah, and they brought close the Eil ha'olah, the ram of the olah. Who brought close? Maybe it was the Zakanim. So it could Vayakrev es Zakanim, es Eil ha'olah, and the elders brought the Eil of the olah. And then Aaron Aaron, and Aaron and his sons placed their hands on the head of the ram. Then it would make perfect sense. There was another person. There was a third person in this text. Maybe it was the elders. And that would explain why the elders show up at the beginning of this week's Torah portion, where it says at the beginning, Vayhi b'yom Shmini, and it was on the 8th day. And then what happened on the 8th day? Kara, Moshe, Aaron, and Levanav, Lezikni Israel, and Moses called to Aaron and his sons and to the elders of Israel. The elders of Israel, they were there the whole previous 7 days of the inauguration, and that's why he now calls them. So the elders were there in the previous portion. They were part of the inauguration of the tabernacle, and that's why they show up here in verse 1, chapter 9. Moses calls them. He's calling everyone who's involved in the inauguration, including the elders. And we know the elders were involved, or at least God wanted the elders to be involved, because we find in verse 15 of chapter 4 that the elders were involved with slaughtering and placing their hands on top of the bullock. So if my thesis here is correct, that in chapter 8 you have a third party showing up here, not just Aaron, not just Moses, but also a third party, which are the elders, they're not mentioned explicitly. Why not? Why wouldn't they be mentioned explicitly? Now, if I was a biblical scholar and I believed in the documentary hypothesis, I might argue that for some reason they were edited down to some point. And that is an interesting argument. I'd love biblical scholars to give me what they think is going on here. The rabbi in me, which wants to understand, well, what can we learn from this? If it's true that the elders were there, and by the way, you might ask, Vayishchatu, which means, and he slaughtered. But that's not elders. That's just one person. Well, only one elder would have slaughtered. Right, so that's fine. The rabbi in me wants to know, what can we learn from the fact that it's written in an anomalous way? You have two piles, one after the other, and this seems to be a feature of the text, not a bug. Why? And if I'm correct that it's mentioning and it's alluding to a third party, why isn't that third party mentioned explicitly? That's question number one. And question number two is, why all of a sudden now do they show up in the beginning of Shmini? Why all of a sudden we find on the 8th day Moses calls the elders? Where were they before? Why aren't the elders featured more often in the text? Only twice in Leviticus, once in chapter 4, once in chapter 9. And why do we have an anomaly in the text, which seems to be two pile? Could that be that the elders were there? And that's why all of a sudden they're called. If my hypothesis is correct, then why is it that they're not mentioned explicitly? What happened here? And why are they called on the 8th day? Now all the commentators ask, why are they all of a sudden called on the 8th day? And they have other questions. I think that they're called because they were part of the inauguration. Why they're not mentioned explicitly is an interesting question. And what can we learn from that? What is the text trying to tell us by not mentioning them explicitly? One might think, just a little thought in the direction my head goes when I think about this, and I'll just put it out there. I'm not saying this is the answer, but the way my head goes when I think about this is that the reason it seems clear to me that these says the elders were part of the inauguration. But the reason why the text doesn't mention them is because they were only part of the inauguration part of it. They were helpers. They weren't the main workers in the tabernacle. They were doing kind of work which wasn't incredibly important to the actual service. You needed helpers here and there, and therefore the text didn't want to make as if these were people who were important as part of the service in the tabernacle. And it could actually be that there were only very few people back then There was Moses and Aaron and a few sons. It was a lot of work. You needed a helping hand. But they didn't want to show that in the future you're going to have the elders as being part of the service in the tabernacle, and therefore they weren't mentioned explicitly because this isn't something that was going to happen for forever. So this was something which was needed at the time in order to have a helping hand in the tabernacle for 7 days. There weren't simply enough hands to do it, and therefore they had the elders helping out, but it wasn't something which was going to continue in the next generation, the generation afterwards, which in the next generations you would have more priests, and those priests would also be able to help out. But you might ask, why the elders then? Why not the Levites? The Levites were also, they were singers in the tabernacle. They were involved with things related to the tabernacle. Why the elders? And if it was the elders, why aren't they mentioned explicitly? So I don't really have a full good answer to it, nor what it's trying to teach us. I'd love to hear from you if you have an answer to it. So again, two major questions I have. First of all, why the anomaly in the text of two pause, two verbs, one after the other? That seems to be the way the text goes. If I am right that it's because there's a third party, which is the elders, why aren't they mentioned explicitly? And if I'm wrong, why all of a sudden do the elders show up on the 8th day and Moses is calling them? Why all of a sudden now? So those are my questions. I'm leaving it out there. I don't have really good answers to it, but I'd let you to think about it. I'm giving you, the audience, think about it. Please let me know what your thoughts are. Meanwhile, this has been Levi Brackman with Truths, Jewish Wisdom for today. This is the season of Torah Portion Uncensored. Thank you so much for joining, and until next time.